Fat widow, forced to work in saloon. Mountain man said, "You belong in a palace, not here. Pay your dead man's debt, or I sell you by sunrise." Snake McGrath's voice knifed through the smoke-haze din of the Red Dog Saloon. Laughter died. Cards paused mid-air. Cordelia Delia Hayes stood very still, a tray of sloshing beer mugs trembling in her hands as every eye in Tombstone Gulch turned to watch her humiliation. Rain battered the windows. Piano strings twanged out of tune and then fell silent. "She's a fat widow," a drunk crowed from a corner table. "Plenty of meat to earn her dues." The room erupted jeers, catcalls, a wadded biscuit flung like a stone. Delia flinched but did not beg. She had begged before, over doctor's bills and undertaker's fees, over the last of Thomas Hayes's breath. Begging had never changed the mathematics of men like McGrath. Snake leaned across the bar, his smile as thin as a knife's edge. $200 plus interest. You're out of time, Mrs. Hayes. The Denver madam pays cash for sturdy stock." Delia's cheeks burned. She kept her voice level. "My husband was a schoolmaster. We paid what we could." "Your husband is a corpse," Snake said softly, "and corpses don't pay." The door blew open on a gust of rain and thunder. A giant filled the threshold broad as the doorway, a bearskin cloak dripping on the plank floor, black beard wet with storm. The room seemed to shrink around him. He did not look left or right. He looked at Delia, and the cruelty of the saloon smashed against the wall of his silence and fell away. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low, steady, absolute. "You belong in a palace." Someone laughed, high and brittle. No one joined him. The stranger turned to Snake. "What's her debt?" Snake swallowed. 200, with interest." The giant loosened a leather pouch and poured gold onto the bar. Coins rang like church bells. 500, he said. "Her debt is gone. The rest buys the freedom you're too small to imagine." He faced Delia again, the storm gentling in his eyes. "My name is Nathaniel Grayson. They call me Bear. Will you walk out of this hell with me?" Rain hammered. The saloon held its breath. Delia did not. "Yes," she said. Cordelia Hayes had been many things in her 30 years: a schoolmaster's wife, a woman of modest dignity, a hostess at Sunday suppers where grammar and scripture were discussed with equal reverence. But here, in the Red Dog Saloon, she was reduced to a curiosity, a joke. Her husband's death had stripped her of name and station, leaving her body broad, soft, and weary as the last coin she could spend. Snake McGrath had seen to that. The saloon keeper's ledger showed her husband's debts, swollen with interest and lies. Delia had no family to defend her, no wealth to erase the figures scrawled in ink. So she scrubbed mugs, carried beer, and endured hands that grabbed where they pleased. Each night was a fresh humiliation, men mooing like cattle when she passed, or demanding she waddle faster. She bore it in silence because silence was survival. Yet inside, she carried the memory of Thomas, the man who had courted her with books instead of flowers, who had whispered that she was beautiful when the world sneered otherwise. His death from consumption had been slow and cruel, and when he was gone, so too was her last protector. That night of storm, when the saloon doors crashed open, Delia braced herself for another tormentor, but what entered was something different altogether. Nathaniel Bear Grayson looked carved from the mountain itself. Nearly 7 feet tall, shoulders like oak beams, he carried the storm with him, wet fur, thunder in his eyes, the scent of pine and rain. The men who had tormented Delia shrank back instinctively. Bear's reputation had preceded him. A trapper, a loner, a fighter who had survived grisly claws and lived to tell of it. When he poured gold onto the bar, the clatter silenced even the drunkest mouths. $500 more money than most men in Tombstone Gulch had seen in a lifetime spilled across the wood. Snake licked his lips, torn between greed and fear. That's more than enough. Bear didn't glance at him. His gaze stayed fixed on Delia, steady as an anchor in the storm. "You belong somewhere better than this," he told her, his voice carrying through the hush. "I can't stand by while they tear you apart. Come with me." Delia's tray slipped from her hands, mugs shattering on the floor. For a moment she could not breathe. No one had spoken to her with such certainty in years. She searched his face for mockery, for cruelty disguised as kindness, but found only resolve. Her heart pounded. She knew nothing of this man except that he had just given away a fortune to free her. The saloon's eyes burned into her, daring her to refuse. She thought of the cold room where she slept behind the kitchen, of Snake's threats, of hands she could not stop. And then she thought of Thomas, of what he would want for her. Her voice shook, but her answer was clear. Yes. Bear's hand was warm and solid as he helped her step away from the jeering crowd. Together they walked through the saloon, coins still glittering on the bar, Snake's glare stabbing their backs. Outside, the storm lashed against them, but for the first time in years, Delia felt as though she could breathe. Behind them, whispers rose like smoke. The mountain man bought the widow. She's his now. But to Delia, it did not feel like ownership. It felt like deliverance. The storm did not ease as Bear led Delia out of Tombstone Gulch. Rain lashed the muddy street, turning wagon ruts into rivers. The saloon's light faded behind them, replaced by the black sprawl of mountains rising like jagged teeth against the sky. Delia clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the wind pierced through as if it were nothing. Her boots sank into mud, her lungs burning with every step. She had walked before miles to the schoolhouse, miles to fetch medicine for Thomas, but never into wilderness this raw, this merciless. Bear moved ahead of her, a dark bulk against the storm, steady as a locomotive. When she faltered, he slowed. When she stumbled, his hand closed around her arm, strong and sure, lifting her as though she weighed no more than a child. He never mocked, never scolded. He simply adjusted his stride to hers, his silence speaking louder than words. At a ridge above the town, he paused and glanced back. The saloon's glow was a faint smear in the distance. "Once we cross this pass," he said, his voice low, "there's no turning back. Do you regret it?" Delia's hair clung to her face, soaked through. Her heart thundered. She should have been terrified following a stranger into the mountains. Yet when she looked at him, rain streaming off his fur cloak, jaw set against the storm, she felt steadier than she had in months. "No," she whispered, "I regret staying as long as I did." Something flickered in his eyes, a glimmer, quickly hidden as he turned back to the trail. They climbed for hours, the path twisting through pines that swayed and groaned under the wind. Wolves howled somewhere far off, their cries threading through the night. Delia shivered, but Bear stopped long enough to swing his cloak from his shoulders and wrap it around her. The weight of it nearly swallowed her whole thick fur, heavy with rain, but inside it carried warmth, the scent of smoke and pine, of safety. "You'll freeze without this," she protested. "I don't freeze easy," he replied. And that was the end of it. At last, they reached a sheltered hollow where Bear built a fire with practiced hands. Sparks leapt into the storm, and soon a blaze roared against the darkness. Delia sat close, soaking in its heat, her body trembling with exhaustion. Bear handed her a strip of dried venison from his pack. "Eat." She obeyed, chewing slowly, the salt sharp on her tongue. He crouched across from her, his scarred face lit by firelight. For the first time, she could study him without the haze of the saloon, the lines cut deep around his mouth, the pale claw mark across his cheek, the eyes that held both storms and still waters. "You're not afraid of me?" he said suddenly. Delia blinked. "Should I be? Most are." She thought of Snake McGrath, of drunken hands and cruel laughter. She thought of the fear that had lived in her chest for years. Then she looked at Bear and felt, not fear, but something steadier. "You don't frighten me," she said softly. "You stop them." His gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded once, as if satisfied, and leaned back against a log. That night, wrapped in his cloak beside the fire, Delia closed her eyes to the rhythm of rain on the trees. For the first time in months, she slept without the dread of waking to jeers or threats. At dawn, the storm cleared, unveiling mountains draped in snow, peaks burning gold under the rising sun. Bear gestured toward them. "That's Black Bear Ridge. My home's beyond it." Delia stared at the jagged horizon, awe mingling with fear. She had no idea what awaited her there. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt she was walking toward something, not away. And at her side, the man called Bear strode as though he had been waiting all his life to lead her there. The climb up Black Bear Ridge seemed endless. Trails narrowed to ledges, snowdrifts swallowed the path, and the air grew thin and sharp. Delia's legs ached, but Bear's hand was always there steadying her when the rocks shifted, guiding her steps where the ice gleamed treacherous. By the time they reached the crest, the world stretched wide, valleys like seas of pine, peaks stabbing into clouds, rivers frozen silver. Below the ridge, tucked against the mountainside, stood a cabin unlike any Delia had imagined. It was no rough shack thrown together by a hermit. This was a great lodge built from massive pine logs, each beam hand-hewn and fitted tight. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Carved shutters framed the windows, their designs intricate as lace. It looked less like a frontier cabin than a fortress and a sanctuary. Bear pushed open the heavy door, and warmth spilled out. Inside, firelight glowed across a vast room with rafters high as a church roof. Furs lined the walls, thick rugs softened the floor, and shelves groaned under books bound in leather. Against one wall stood a long oak table, polished smooth. Against another, a carved rocking chair. It was a place of strength, but also of surprising grace. Delia stopped just inside the threshold, overwhelmed. "This is yours?" Bear's eyes flickered with something almost shy. "Ours, if you'll have it." He led her to a chamber off the main hall. Delia gasped softly. A bed stood waiting broad, layered with quilts, beside a wardrobe of cedar and a vanity with a polished mirror. Candles stood ready, their light waiting to be struck. "I made this room long ago," Bear admitted, his voice low. "I thought maybe one day." He did not finish the thought, but his meaning was clear. He had built it with hope, though he had lived alone all these years. Delia brushed her hand over the quilt. Her throat tightened. No one had prepared such a place for her since Thomas. Not even Thomas. In truth, he had loved her deeply, but their means had been humble. This was reverence. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Bear split wood, his axe biting clean through the logs. Delia watched at first, then shyly asked if he might show her. He placed the axe in her hands, steadying her grip, guiding her swing. The log did not split, but her laughter rang through the cold air. "Again," Bear said, the corner of his mouth twitching toward a smile. She cooked what she could with what he had stored. Stews from venison, bread from coarse flour, herbs hung to dry along the rafters. Bear always waited for her to eat first, as if it were law. When she protested, he simply said, "Ladies before men," and left no room for argument. Evenings were spent by the fire. Bear carved wood with his knife birds, deer, once even a delicate rose that seemed impossibly detailed. Delia mended shirts, her fingers clumsy but learning. Sometimes he read aloud from one of his books, Poe, Emerson, Hawthorne. His deep voice wrapped the words in weight and music. Delia listened, spellbound, realizing she had nearly forgotten the joy of being spoken to with respect. And slowly she began to change. The shame pressed into her bones by Snake's taunts loosened. She moved more easily, laughed more freely. She dared to tell stories of her childhood, of her husband's classroom, of the dreams she had once tucked away. Bear listened, not with impatience, not with condescension, but with the full gravity of a man who believed her words mattered. One night, as snow fell thick outside and the fire painted the cabin in gold, Delia caught herself humming while she kneaded dough. She paused, startled. She could not remember the last time a tune had left her lips. Bear looked up from his carving. "That's a fine sound," he said simply. Heat rose to her cheeks, but she did not stop. For the first time in years, Delia felt not like a burden to be carried, nor a debt to be collected, but a woman with worth, with a voice, with a place. And though the mountain storm still raged beyond the walls, inside Bear's cabin she found something she had thought lost forever: hope. Spring crept across Black Bear Ridge, melting the drifts and sending streams rushing down the mountainside. In the cabin, Delia and Bear lived as though in a fragile dream. She baked bread that filled the air with warmth. He tanned hides and carved wood with steady hands. Yet dreams rarely last without interruption. The first sign came in whispers. Traders passing up the trail brought news. Snake McGrath was spreading tales in Tombstone Gulch. He told anyone who would listen that the mountain man had stolen a widow against her will. He called Bear a brute, a savage hoarder of gold, a kidnapper hiding his prize on the ridge. The stories grew wilder with each telling, and soon even the sheriff began to take notice. When Bear returned from a supply run one evening, his jaw was set, his eyes storm-dark. Delia was stirring stew, and the ladle stilled in her hand when she saw his face. "What happened?" she asked. He placed a folded newspaper on the table. The headline shouted, "Widow held captive by beast of Black Bear Mountain." Delia's stomach dropped. Her hands trembled as she read the words. "But everyone in town knows I went willingly. They saw." "Doesn't matter," Bear muttered. "McGrath's poison spreads easier than truth, and he's not after you alone." Delia looked up. "Then what does he want?" Bear hesitated. His silence stretched until the fire popped loudly in the hearth. Finally, he spoke. "He knows my name, my real one." Delia blinked. Nathaniel Grayson? He nodded once, grim. Son of a family that built half of Boston, they wanted me to carry on their empire, timber, steel, railroads, but their hands were filthy. Bribes, blood, corruption. When I refused, they called me a coward. My betrothed left me for a richer man. So I left it all. I came west to live honest, if alone. Delia reached across the table, laying her hand on his scarred knuckles. You're not alone anymore. His gaze softened, but only for a heartbeat. McGrath sees me as a ransom chest. He's got no use for truth. He'll try to sell lies to the sheriff, or worse, bring men from Denver who'll come with chains instead of questions. Delia's throat tightened. Then we must prepare. But even as she spoke, her own secret gnawed at her. She had not told Bear about the folded deed tucked away in her satchel, the last remnant of her husband's legacy, a patch of land along the river, worthless when Thomas died, until the railroad began buying everything nearby. If McGrath discovered it, he would come not just for Bear's supposed gold, but for her papers too. That night, Delia lay awake beside the fire, listening to the wind claw at the shutters. Bear slept in the rocking chair, rifle across his knees, ever the sentinel. She wanted to confess, to tell him of the deed, of the danger it carried. But fear clamped her tongue. What if he thought she had brought ruin to his mountain? What if he sent her away to spare himself the fight? The following week confirmed her dread. Smoke rose on the horizon one afternoon, and Bear climbed the ridge to see. When he returned, his face was stone. Riders, he said, half a dozen at least, camped at the base of the trail, McGrath's hired muscle. Delia's blood ran cold. The fragile peace of the cabin, the laughter by the hearth, the hope she had just begun to taste all of it, trembled under the weight of looming conflict. Bear checked his rifle, his knives, the hidden traps he had set in the forest years ago. Then he met Delia's eyes. I told myself I'd never fight for anything again, he said, but for you, I will. Her heart ached with fear and something fiercer still pride. She straightened her shoulders. Then you won't fight alone. And so the mountain waited, holding its breath, while man and woman prepared to defend not just a cabin, but the fragile love that had grown within its walls. The night was moonless, the sky choked with clouds. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its embers casting long shadows across the log walls. Delia sat at the table, her hands clasped tight, listening to the silence outside. Even the owls had gone quiet. Then came the sound hooves crunching snow, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of men. Bear was already at the door, rifle in hand. He glanced back at her, his eyes steady. Stay low, and remember what I taught you. Delia's pulse hammered, but she nodded. A voice boomed from the darkness. Stone, or Grayson, or whatever you call yourself, bring out the widow, and maybe we let you live. Snake McGrath, his oily drawl carried through the night like poison. Bear stepped onto the porch, his towering frame lit faintly by the glow of the hearth behind him. She's free, he called back. She stays with me because she chooses it. You want her, you'll have to take her over my dead body. Laughter answered him, cruel and eager. Then the crack of a rifle split the night. The bullet slammed into the porch beam inches from Bear's head. The fight began. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bear fired back, every shot deliberate, echoing across the ridge. Men cursed and dove for cover. Delia, crouched by the window, gripped the smaller rifle he had taught her to use. Her hand shook, but when a shadow moved near the barn, she took aim and fired. The man fell with a cry. Her breath caught. She had never fired on another soul before, but this was her home now, her life, and she would not be dragged back to chains. The battle raged. Bullets shattered shutters, splintered the door. Bear moved like a force of nature, calm under fire, his rifle an extension of his will. But there were too many. Shadows pressed closer, circling the cabin like wolves. Then McGrath himself stepped forward, revolver in one hand, torch in the other. "You can't hold forever, Stone," he shouted. "Come out, or I burn this place to the ground." Delia rose from her crouch. Before Bear could stop her, she pushed the door open and stepped into the icy night. Her voice rang clear. "You think you can sell me like cattle, Snake McGrath? You think you can shame me into silence? No more. I am not your debt, not your property, not your plaything. This cabin is mine as much as his, and you'll not lay a finger on it." For a moment, silence fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. Bear's chest swelled with pride. He leveled his rifle and growled, "You heard the lady. Leave now, or you don't leave at all." McGrath's face twisted with rage. He hurled the torch, but Bear's shot struck it mid-air, sparks scattering harmlessly into the snow. The men behind McGrath, seeing his power broken and their own skins at risk, began to melt into the trees. McGrath cursed, but when Bear advanced, rifle steady, even he stumbled back, fear flashing in his eyes. The would-be conqueror turned and fled into the night, his hired gun scattering after him. The mountain was silent again. Bear lowered his weapon, turning to Delia. She still stood tall in the snow, breath white in the darkness, eyes blazing. He had never seen her more beautiful. "You were right to speak," he said softly, "and I was proud to stand beside you." The snow lay scarred with boot prints and bloodstains, but by morning the mountain was silent once more. Smoke curled peacefully from the chimney as though the cabin itself had endured the siege and emerged stronger for it. Delia sat by the hearth, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her rifle resting against the wall. Her hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the echo of courage. She had faced Snake McGrath, spoken her truth before the world, and found she was not broken, but whole. Bear entered, brushing snow from his cloak. He looked at her for a long moment, his stern face softened by something gentler. He set his rifle aside and knelt by her chair. "You were braver than any soldier I ever knew," he said quietly. Delia met his gaze, tears glimmering. "I wasn't brave alone. You gave me reason." He took her hand, rough and scarred fingers closing around hers. For years he had lived in silence, his heart buried under loss. But now, sitting with her by the fire, he felt something return, something he thought gone forever. "This is your home now," he murmured, "if you'll have it." Delia's voice caught. She nodded, unable to speak, her tears falling freely. She had found more than shelter. She had found dignity restored, and a love that saw her not as a debt nor a burden, but as a queen in her own right. Outside, the mountain winds howled. Inside, the fire glowed bright. Could their love withstand the whispers of townsfolk, the schemes of men like McGrath, the weight of a world that had always judged them? Only time and the mountain would answer. Stories like Delia and Bear's remind us that even in the harshest places, love can bloom like fire in the snow. No woman deserves to be treated as less than she is, and sometimes it takes a single voice of courage to change everything. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Share it in the comments below. And if you still believe in love that sees the heart, not the surface. Stay with us. The next story we tell may be the one that speaks straight to your soul.